First of all, thank you, Jenny, for your kind words regarding the legislation on marriage equality. I'm here with a few hours of sleep, but I think it's a milestone decision for my country. I'm very proud to be able to introduce it as a leader of a center-right government. Now, coming back to your question, when I look at many European countries and I observe their fiscal position over the past 30 years, I think a lot about the fact that Greece never really had a peace dividend, in the sense that we were constantly faced with geopolitical threats in our neighborhood, and even during the very difficult years, we were always spending more than 2% of our budget, of our GDP on defense. So in our case, it didn't really take a lot to increase our ability to finance our defense spending, because we faced very particular geopolitical challenges, which maybe other European countries, clearly after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, didn't feel the need to spend that much on defense. But to the point of this debate, can you do foreign policy on a budget? The simple answer for me is no. We will all need to be able to spend more on defense, but also be much smarter in terms of how we allocate funds to defense. I was reading an article by the President of the Commission, or an interview actually she gave you, and she was very clear about the necessity to mobilize more funds, both at the national but also at the European level, which is going to be a challenge at a time when our budgets are under pressure, because we also need to finance the climate transition and the technological transition. We're faced with higher interest rates, and we're coming out of COVID. We had to spend much more to recover from the pandemic. So at the end of the day, Greece has been able to achieve what you described as a situation where we can spend more on defense while bringing down our debt to GDP ratio, simply because our economy has been growing much faster than the Eurozone average. At the end of the day, if the economy doesn't grow, you will not have the necessary funds to finance either defense or climate. So underlying growth and competitiveness of our economies, in my mind, is absolutely critical. True for Greece, I think true for Germany, true for all European countries. We have been constantly overshooting our fiscal targets, and this growth has been able to allow us to do more, not just on defense, but also on social policy. Now, when we look at the European scene, I think one of the challenges for the next European cycle is how do we do more on defense? Does this mean more fiscal capacity at the European level? Does this mean giving the EIB a mandate to finance more defense-related projects, which may be longer term and involve a higher risk? What it certainly means, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a defense buyer, is a clear streamlining of the European defense industry, which is currently incredibly fragmented. For example, when we sort of are looking to purchase a new ship, a new frigate or a new corvette, we're faced with 5 or 6 different offers from different European countries, different European shippers. That doesn't make much sense. We need to agree which are the projects where we need to pool resources and where we can actually be competitive, also vis-a-vis the US. If you look at fighter planes, do we really have a plane now that can compete with a 5th generation US-made fighter? The answer is probably not. So at some point we'll also need to take some strategic decisions. Where do we pool our resources? And this will allow us actually to purchase European. One final point, very important, that in the new fiscal rules, we agreed to treat defense spending in a slightly different way. In other words, under certain circumstances, defense spending will not count towards the excessive budget calculations. This is something we insisted on, and this also makes the case that when we look at all the spending portfolio, defense, because of its critical importance, is something different, and something which is existential and that important to be also treated differently from an accounting point of view. So I think this is also an important step in the right direction. Hopefully we will be able to use these exceptions, but it's good to know that this possibility actually exists.
Just you mentioned the need for streamlining, and that there were, procurement processes were far too complicated, and there were too many providers. One of the things that Ursula von der Leyen said in her interview, and it was to the FT, not to us, But I understood her to say that you needed to look perhaps at the model of COVID financing and what the European Commission had done there. Do you think there is a role for joint financing on defence? How far do you think the Europeanization of defence should go?
Well, this is probably a question you should also
I will, but I'm asking you first.
to my dear friend, the Minister of Finance. Look, what we did after COVID was incredibly important. And I remember my discussions with Angela Merkel at the time. She was very skeptical at the beginning, but I think we managed to convince her. And the Next Generation EU is, in my mind, a milestone European project. And we're using these funds to drive the green transition, to drive the digital transition, to make our economies more competitive. And of course, I understand the skepticism by frugal countries, how do you actually use the European funds? But at the end of the day, if we make a good case out of the Next Generation EU, I think we will have a convincing argument to be able to not necessarily create a new Next Generation EU, but to contemplate in a more convincing manner what does it mean to actually create more resources, more own resources at the European level. Just make one quick comment based on what you said. When we look at the way our defense departments make procurement decisions, they're really not at all thinking about the changing nature of warfare. So it's long-term projects, big ships, big plane purchases, but we need to make sure that our departments, defense and finance, are ready to take into account the changing nature of warfare and incorporate new technologies which may be much cheaper, much more innovative, much easier to deploy. And this requires a different mindset when it comes to very sort of traditional public departments that have been trained to think only in one particular way. As I was listening to your comment about our particular context, and again, we've had our own geopolitical challenges facing an aggressive neighbor to our east, and we always felt, and we continue to do so, that we need to spend enough to have a credible deterrence. However, we are certainly trying to reach out to Turkey to establish normal and better relations. And in the long term, because this is a long-term process, yes, this at some point could lead to a more permanent détente that would force us to slightly, but I stress the word, slightly rethink the way we allocate funds to our defense industry. But I think when you are in very complicated sort of geopolitical positions, I mean, the risk of being too naive in terms of your long-term planning can actually lead you in, within a few years to find yourself in a very, very compromised position. So I think we all, strive for peace, but at some point, there's also this well-known axiom that if you want peace, prepare for war. And I think that the mindset right now in Europe is very much along those lines, because you just cannot underestimate the trauma of a war in the European heartland. It's something which was completely inconceivable 3-4 years ago, and certainly to a generation which grew up after the collapse of the Berlin War and went through the 90s and 2000s, with this sort of optimism that the dark continent had left its darkness sort of behind it. This is sort of a shock and a very rude wake-up call. As you said, there are G20 countries, so it does not participate in those gatherings where the very, very important decisions are taking place. But I would like to come back to the point that you raised before regarding fundamental trust and the ability at some point to distinguish between those areas where we have to work together and those areas where it's only natural for us to be strategic competitors. What I do know is that when these issues become very politicized and become part of the domestic debate, then usually we don't take the most rational decisions, and that's why it's good to come to these sort of gatherings because I think it puts things into a much clearer perspective, and it is also a great opportunity for us to talk to our counterparts from China to understand how we can find this admittedly very complicated balance.